A very, 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 very good day to all of our little science explorers. On behalf of my partner Vanessa Teaño, I am Charles Bautista and welcome to our TED Talk. On today's episode, we are going to talk about Tourette syndrome. So this is a mini symposium about the definition, history, causes, and many more about Tourette syndrome. Since not a lot of you are educated or informed about the correct concept about Tourette syndrome, we are here to talk about it. So let's first start with the definition of the Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome belongs to a spectrum of neurodevelopmental conditions referred to as tic disorder. So magbigay tayo ng emphasis sa neurodevelopmental condition. So Tourette syndrome ay condition na na-develop sa brain. So neuro kasi means brain. So Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder characterized by sudden, repetitive, rapid, and unwanted movement or vocal sounds called tics. So tics nga ay yung sudden, rapid, recurrent motor movements or vocalizations. So sudden at hindi mapigilan, sabi rin ng mga may Tourette syndrome na nahihirapan din sila kapag bigla-bigla na lang sinusumpong yung mga tics nila dahil nga bigla-bigla. So, since Tourette syndrome ay nasa brain, mahirap nga talagang i-control yan. So, ang other name ng Tourette syndrome ay Tourette disorder, Tourette's syndrome, or Giles de la Tourette's syndrome. So, ang basic criteria for Tourette syndrome diagnosis ay kung meron kang motor tics and at least one vocal tic present for more than a year. So the first signs of Tourette syndrome usually occur in children between the ages of 7 and 10, but they can begin as early as 2 years or as late as 18. So, yung gap ng Tourette syndrome ay 7 to 10, pero pwede siyang ma-develop or pwedeng magpakita yung symptoms as early as 2 years old or as late as 18 years old. Pero tics that begin after age 18 are not considered symptoms of Tourette syndrome. There are two types of tics. Yung una dyan ay ang motor tics involving movement. So motor, sa movement nga siya. So nagpapakita yung symptoms as arm or head jerking, blinking, making a face, mouth twitching, or shoulder shrugging. So movement nga. Yung next naman ay yung vocal tics or yung pagsasalita. Andyan yung biglang magbabark, clearing yung throat, yung mga ganun, coughing, grunting, repeating what someone else says, shouting, sniffing, and swearing. Even swearing is a symptom sa vocal tics. So next, dumako naman tayo sa history ng Tourette syndrome. Bakit nga ba mayroong Tourette syndrome? Ano nga ba yung history nun? So ang Tourette syndrome was first described in 1885 and it was described by Georges Albert Edward Brutus Giles de la Tourette. Ulitin natin, Georges Albert Edward Brutus Giles de la Tourette. So siya ang first na naka-describe dito. So cases with tics have been as far back as the 15th century. According to the book Malleus Maleficarum, translating to Hammer of Witches, it is a priest is described as having tics blamed on demonic possessions. So, diba? So, knowing the history of Tourette syndrome, since meron na siya 15th century pa lang, and hindi pa aware and knowledgeable ang mga tao about it. So, nagkakaroon agad ng stigma and judgment na demonic agad ito since yung symptoms nga niya, as I've said sa definition, ay parang napopossess dahil ngayong sudden, bigla-bigla na lang sisigaw or magmumura, ganyan, hindi nila makontrol yung galaw nila. So, di ba nagkakaroon ng judgment ang society dahil hindi sila aware sa mga disorder na katulad nito. Pero, now, both tics and TS are recognized in the DSM and are recognized as neurodevelopmental on origin. So, hindi na siya sinasabi na demonic possession ngayon dahil nga na-recognize na siya in DSM, which is good. So next naman is ano yung mga causes ng Tourette syndrome. First, sa under ng cause ay ang genetic factors. A mutation involving the SLI-TRK1 gene. The SLI-TRK1 gene provides instruction for making a protein that is a member of the SLI-TRK family. Proteins in this family are found in the brain. So ano nga bang SLI-TRK1? So SLI-TRK1 play a role in the growth and development of nerve cells. So kapag nagkaroon ng mutation sa normal function of the SLI-TRK1 gene, ibig sabihin pwede magkaroon ng neuro disorder or disorder sa brain at yun yung isa sa mga sinasabi na cause ng Tourette syndrome. So next is family and twin studies have shown that the majority of cases of Tourette syndrome are inherited. However, several decades of research have shown that this is unlikely the case. Dahil Tourette syndrome was previously thought to have an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance with about a 50% chance of parents passing the gene on their children. Pero Tourette syndrome most likely result from a variety of genetic and environmental factors, not changes in a single gene. Maganda na na-debunk natin yung misconceptions regarding causes of Tourette syndrome dahil sa research. So researching about a disorder is really important para maging knowledgeable tayo about it. Lalo na kapag hindi naman masyadong recognize or hindi natin masyadong alam or bago pa lang sa atin yung disorder na yun. So next causes is Tourette syndrome can be triggered by abnormal metabolism of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. Ano nga ba ang dopamine? Dopamine is a type of neurotransmitter responsible for the communication between nerve cells. That is why it is sometimes called as chemical messenger. It plays a role in how we feel pleasure. Yun ang dopamine. So, present ng mga researches na dopamine is involved sa abnormal activity ng brain dahil dopamine excess or supersensitivity of the postsynaptic dopamine receptors can trigger Tourette syndrome. So, yun nga, ang dopamine can be triggered by abnormal metabolism. So, next is boys with the genes are 3 to 4 times more likely to display symptoms of Tourette syndrome than girls. So, commonly sa boys with affected gene are mas nagpapakita ng symptoms ng Tourette syndrome. So, last cause sa genetic factors is the syndrome is believed to be linked to problems in certain areas of the brain and the chemical substances that help nerve cells talk to one another. Gaya ng in-explain ko sa letter C, natitrigger ang tics or Tourette syndrome dahil nga sa abnormal activity ng brain. So, doon tayo magbigay ng emphasis. Normal activity, nakaka-trigger din ng Tourette syndrome kapag nagre-release sila ng mga chemical substances. So, next factor is the environmental factors like smoking during pregnancy. Yan, kapag nag-smoke ka talaga when you are pregnant, hindi magkakaroon ng side effect yan with the baby. It's either magkakaroon siya ng disorder or what, or hindi magiging maganda yung result, ganyan. Next is pregnancy complications, also low birth weight. So let's tackle about this low birth weight. Ano nga ba ito? Ang low birth weight ay term na ginagamit para i-describe ang mga babies na pinanganak weighing less than 5 pounds and 8 ounces or 2,500 grams. So low birth weight is most often caused by premature birth. Next naman dun ay infections. Researchers have found mixed results about whether certain children are more likely to develop tics following infections. So, let's give emphasis on this infection dahil yung ibang research sinasabi na yes, infection can be a result of Tourette syndrome, pero sabi naman ng ibang researchers hindi daw. Dahil nga infection, hindi naman din yan napupunta sa brain, ganyan, since ang Tourette syndrome niya is neurodevelopmental condition. So, meron pa rin parang hindi pagkakaunawaan tungkol dito sa infections. So, itakal naman natin itong neurobiology of Tourette syndrome. So, medyo madugo to, and let's discuss and digest kung ano nga ba ang neurobiology nito. So, a series of parallel striatal thalamocortical circuits that link specific regions of the frontal cortex to subcortical structures has provided a framework for understanding the interconnected neurobiological relationships that exist between Tourette syndrome and its multiple comorbid problems. In classical models of movement disorders, the basal ganglia was believed to influence behavior by changing cortical excitability through the interplay of the direct and the multisynaptic or indirect to subthalamic nucleus pathway. According to this model, hyperkinetic disorder were the result of increased cortical excitability due to either a reduction of direct pathway excitatory effect or an increase in the indirect inhibitory effect. Since this direct or indirect pathway approach failed to address the specificity of tics, other hypotheses have been developed that view the basal ganglia as performing a process of action selection. This includes focus facilitation of selected movement and inhibition of competing motor patterns. Within this system, tics are viewed as a focal excitatory abnormality in the striatum that causes an erroneous inhibition of a group of neurons in the GPI, and in turn, a disinhibition of cortical neurons. So medyo madugo nga yung neurobiology of Tourette syndrome. Pero to simplify that, the neurobiology of Tourette syndrome has been linked to different parts of the brain, including yung palaging nababanggit dito sa definition na to, which is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia helps control body movement kasi since affected din ang person's central nervous system, the person cannot control their movement or sound that are repeated over and over. Dahil nga naglilink yung disorder sa basal ganglia, which helps control body movement. Hindi nakokontrol ng taong may Tourette syndrome yung kanyang movement. Kaya ito nagpapakita ng symptoms. So, yun lang. So, Vane, anong chika natin dyan?
Yes, thank you, Charles. Hello, our dear science explorers. So, we are still here in the discussion in the mini symposium about Tourette syndrome. So, we already discussed about its definition, its causes, its history, the neurobiology of TS. Now, we are going to tackle about the genetics of Tourette syndrome. So, first off, is that there are a lot of studies being made by genetics since this is a gene attacker. So, twin studies of Polderman et al. 2015 concludes that genetics explain a large portion, but not all, of risk for TS and tic disorders in general. So, according to Mateix, Coles et al. 2015, a Swedish registry, and Brown et al. 2015, a Danish registry, their family studies concludes within population of Tourette syndrome and other tic disorder diagnosis cluster within families consistent with genetic contribution to risk. So, Another studies is that about the genome-wide association studies that focused on the variants that are common in the population tells us that family history enriched cases is larger than family history depleted cases, for about 0.56 versus 0.29. So other efforts being given by the genetics is that we can now identify a specific genetic variation that contribute to Tourette syndrome risk. How? By the use of modern DNA genotyping or sequencing technologies to collect genetic data, or we can conduct formal case or control studies on the data collected. So these are the efforts and the advancement given to us by genetics. So, to tackle about its variants, that Tourette syndrome has a variant named rare copy number variant, or the CNV. This is credited to Wang et al. 2018. That this variant is the gain or loss of DNA segments in the genome that can vary in dosage, length, and details of gene disruptions, whereas the variant of de novo origin is a mechanism by which genes originate from non-functional DNA regions. So, if you are going to compare, kapag CNV is the gain or loss of DNA segments, while the de novo origin is the mechanism of non-functional DNA regions. Kaya nagkakaroon ng abnormality sa ating mga cells, sa ating mga neurons, sa ating mga brain cells because of this gain and loss or the mechanism in the non-functional DNA regions. So, we're going to present to you the data and statistics on Tourette syndrome. This is from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, and this is the National Public Health Agency of the United States. So, ang data na ito ay galing sa US. We cannot find latest data, statistics, or any statistics about Tourette syndrome here in the Philippines. Super rare. That's why we're going to present to you the US data, since they hold the most number of children and adults having this syndrome. So, this is the graph that tells us that there are 44% having moderate or severe TS. Sabi no, almost half of the number of the people having Tourette syndrome ay moderate or severe yung kanilang tics or yung symptoms ng TS sa kanila. And as what Charles mentioned a while ago, that boys were about 3 times more likely to have TS than girls. And dahil sabi ka din Charles, this is also that Tourette syndrome is also caused by environmental factors such as racial and ethnic groups, socioeconomic backgrounds. And children 12 to 17 years of age were more than twice as likely to have diagnosis of TS than children 6 to 11 years of age. Charles already mentioned that and why that happened. So, did you know that 5 in 6 children with Tourette syndrome have another mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder? So, grabe no? Look at this data na nandito ka na, may Tourette syndrome ka na nga lang. Then, you're also suffering from anxiety problems, diba? From autism, depression, developmental delays. So, we can see that it's really hard to have disorders, specifically in the brain, in the neuron. So, what we can now see, what are the impacts? So, this is a disease. What do we expect? Problems. So, in the education, in the social competence, in the health and healthcare, in the parenting, diba? Ano ang may bibigay nila? You can read in every bullet. It's not normal. You know, when you have chance, you can watch a episode of Rated K about this Tourette syndrome. Hindi lang sa education, hindi lang sa social competence, hindi lang sa parenting. Actually, napakarami pang impact ang Tourette syndrome. You know, there's a driver na nagiging hadlang ang Tourette syndrome sa kanya. He can drive well, pero yung tics nga niya, hindi niya makontrol. Nag-aalanganin yung mga pasahero niyang sumakay sa kanya. Ano pa, they suffer bullying. Lalo na dito sa ating bansa, napakadaling mambully, napakadaling mang-insultong mga tao. So, yan ang mga kasama, parang package ng Tourette syndrome. So, I'm not wondering why the top on our list is anxiety. Just look at this, di ba? Head anxiety problems. Siguro dahil yun nga sa mga natatanggap nila from our society. Now, let's look on how Tourette syndrome is being treated. So, we have medications that block the dopamine, as what Charles said, that dopamine triggers our cells to act involuntarily. We have alpha adrenergic agonists, the stimulant medications, antidepressants, but take note that these drugs may have or cause side effects and should be carefully managed by a physician or healthcare provider. So, what are other treatments? We have behavioral treatments, we have psychotherapy, we have, may I add this, we have yoga, merong mga relaxations na ginagawa, may mga exercises na ginagawa just to lessen the effect of Tourette syndrome. And may I share this to you that our government here in the Philippines are also extending their help to those people who have Tourette syndrome. And this is the Senate Act Series 2566 introduced by our late Senator Miriam Santiago that gives awareness about Tourette syndrome and gives privilege exclusively to our friends challenge Filipino people having Tourette syndrome. And there's also organization that empowers and inspires our Filipino citizen who has Tourette syndrome. This is the Philippine Tourette Syndrome Association. So if may kakilala kayo na may TS, you can connect and contact them via Facebook. You can search Philippine Tourette Syndrome Association. Lahat tayo ay pwedeng makatreat, maging treatment ng mga kaibigan, ng ating kababayan, at ng mga taong may Tourette syndrome. So, how can we do that? Always extend kindness. Diba? Hindi na normal ang kanilang mundo, but we can give them a normal world. How? Treat them with kindness and always extend help. Diba? To overcome this disease. So, let's stop this stigma and let us always extend kindness. And ulit-ulit so that para mas lalo tayong maging aware that hindi lang mga taong naka-wheelchair ang may disability. So, we are your speakers. I'm Vanessa Taanyo, and together with my partner, Charles Bautista. So, this is the sources of this symposium. And we thank you all for having you with us through this whole duration of our symposium. And as a prize for you who listened carefully to our symposium, just answer this: what percentage of children with TS are also depressed? So the four commentors who will comment correctly will get the load worth 20 pesos as a prize. So comment now and answer this: what percentage of children with TS are also depressed? That's all. Our dear science explorers, this is a symposium about Tourette syndrome. That's all, and thank you. God bless.